Hi, this is Tom Sheehy with the Sheehy Strategy Group. I'm in Sacramento this afternoon. It's January 24th, and I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon about the state's fiscal picture and the budget that Governor Newsom just released to the legislature on January 10th, just 2 weeks ago today. There's a lot of good things to talk about when you look at the state's fiscal situation, and Governor Newsom has continued the same good luck and mostly the same path as his predecessor, Governor Brown. For those of you that have paid attention to states' finances over the last couple of decades, you know that Governors Wilson, then Governor Davis, and then Governor Schwarzenegger all faced double-digit, multi-billion-dollar budget deficits. They had a couple of years in each one of those administrations where the budget was balanced, but for the most part, they spent a lot of their time as governor trying to keep the state's fiscal picture solvent so that our bond ratings didn't go down and so that we didn't miss our general obligation payments, which are so critical for the state to be on top of and make. Jerry Brown came into office. He was handed off a double-digit budget deficit by his predecessor, Governor Schwarzenegger, and his first budget, he had a deficit he had to work with as well. But in his subsequent budgets and in Governor Newsom's first budget and now his second budget, the states had surpluses. So if we look at the big picture of the state's fiscal situation and budgets, there's a lot of things that we should feel good about. This is the eighth in a row, 8 years in a row, we've had a truly balanced budget that has been proposed. And each year the legislature has enacted that balanced budget. The Democrats have really say on everything now after Prop 25 because it's a majority vote budget. And the numbers of Republicans in the legislature have dropped so low, the Democrats don't need them at all in order to approve a budget. So the Republicans are pretty much dealt out of any serious budget discussions. On the revenue side, we have record revenues. The general fund revenues are over $150 billion this year, which is great. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Governor Newsom's budget has a $21 billion reserve. That's a combination of the rainy day fund and a couple of other special reserves for economic uncertainty. He's got a total budget surplus after all required expenses of about $5.9 billion. So everything looks pretty good. This budget, like his budget last year and Governor Brown's budgets, pays down debt, puts additional money into the rainy day fund. There's record levels of spending in Prop 98. The schools are really well funded. And of course, this budget also reflects the priorities and the values of this governor by putting more money into child care and into poverty programs. The total general fund spending is at about $153 billion. That's about a $7 billion increase from last year. And the growth in revenue is largely being fueled by capital gains taxes. So everything I've said sounds pretty good. And those of you budget wonks out there know that there's another side to this story. And that's what I'd like to touch on a little bit. I'm not going to wear green eye shades and go through an accounting of where all the extra money's going, but I want to step back and take a look at the bigger picture and express some concerns that I think we need to at least be aware of when we think about how the state's going to spend its money. So I said that the state general fund, which is the primary fund that funds government as opposed to the special funds, for example, gasoline taxes help go into the state highway account, help pay for roads. The money you pay the DMV and car registration goes in the motor vehicle account and helps pay for the DMV and other transportation-related programs. Those monies don't come out of the general fund. But all the money for education, all the money for the state's health and welfare programs, public safety, our institutions of incarceration, and general government expenses, that all comes out of the state general fund. So usually when you read in the papers or hear on the radio or TV when they talk about the, quote, state budget, they're really talking about the general fund. And I told you a few moments ago, the general fund's got record revenues. Spending is up $7 billion over last year. We've got over $150 billion in general fund revenue. And that's pretty amazing. But the thing that a lot of folks don't really pay attention to is where's all that revenue coming from? And is where it's coming from a stable source, and what concern should we have about the source of those revenues? Well, I'll break it down real simply. The general fund has three main sources of revenue. It's got personal income taxes, sales taxes, and corporate taxes. Personal income taxes account for 70% of the state general fund revenue. Sales tax accounts for about 20%, and corporate taxes accounts for about 10%. So you're almost at 3/4 of the general fund budget comes from personal income taxes. It's at 70%. Let's break that down another level. If 70% of the general fund revenue, so we're talking about well over $100 billion now, comes from the personal income tax, what makes that up? And the dirty little secret in Sacramento is that the top 1% of taxpayers in the state of California pay over 50% of those personal income taxes that go into the state general fund. And if the personal income tax is 70% of the general fund, and 50% of it is paid by the top 1%, then that means that top 1% is controlling over 1/3 of the general fund budget. Now, how many tax returns are we talking about? How many people are in that top 1%? Well, the Franchise Tax Board, which has all this data and collects the personal income tax, if you look at their statistics, it'll tell you that about 140,000 returns, 140,000 individual tax returns make up that top 1%. So those folks are controlling over 1/3 of the state general fund spending. Some people may say, so what? Let's tax the rich. Who cares? The problem is that when the state runs into an economic slowdown, when the state of California has a recession, the revenue drops off far more rapidly from that top 1% because a lot of their income, in fact, most of their income comes from investment revenue. It's not coming from W-2 taxes on their labor. It's coming from capital gains on the sale of assets like stocks, real estate, businesses, other assets. And when the United States has a mild recession, California gets a severe case of influenza. And what we've seen in past recessions is a modest budget surplus can very quickly turn into a drastic double-digit budget deficit. So one of the things that Jerry Brown was able to accomplish in the 8 years he was governor, and I think you got to give him credit along with the legislature and the Democrats that control the legislature, is they created a rainy day fund and they socked away about $19 billion into that rainy day fund. And Governor Newsom has continued that policy, and he's now got a total reserves in the rainy day fund and the reserve for economic uncertainty of about $21 billion. And so that's a lot of money. That's great. I mean, you got to really give credit to him. The problem is that the legislative analysts will tell you, and even the California Department of Finance acknowledges, is that in a mild recession, that rainy day fund gets wiped out in one budget cycle. So if we have any sort of, and why is that? That's because the capital gains revenues are going to drop dramatically. Right now, in the budget that Governor Newsom submitted to us 2 weeks ago, the California Department of Finance is reporting record capital gains revenues. They're up over $156 billion in capital gains. And when you look at the taxes on that, the personal income tax rates on that money, we're getting, between $14 and $16 billion in general fund tax revenue just from those capital gains. And since we already know that the bulk of those capital gains are coming from this, uber rich population, the question is, what happens during the recession? Well, I've already sort of told you those numbers drop off dramatically. And then what happens is the state is immediately facing a really severe budget situation. We're going to be insulated from that now thanks to the rainy day fund, but that insulation is not going to be enough to protect us from a prolonged recession. And this, of course, is what Governor Brown was so concerned about. Now, Governor Newsom, in his first budget, he had a surplus, just like Governor Brown did for 7 out of the 8 years he was governor. And Governor Newsom took some of that surplus money, and he went above and beyond the requirements of current law and built those reserves up even higher. And, of course, Governor Brown did that each year he was governor when he had surpluses. He put more money into reserves than he was required to under the law. The Legislative Analyst's Office came out with their preliminary analysis of the governor's budget, and they point out that Governor Newsom has now broken with that tradition. In this year's budget, despite having a $6 billion operating surplus, he didn't put a dime more into the rainy day reserve than what was the minimum amount required under the law. So he met the minimum requirements, but he didn't put a dollar more into it. And instead, he chose to spend that money on discretionary programs, and some of which are permanent and ongoing spending. So, the game with the budget is if you don't like how much the state's spending, you say, what would you cut? And there's a constituency for every program. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot of poverty in California, and so there's no end to our ability to do more to help people without money. But the thing is that when we have a recession and the budget goes into the red, you can't maintain all those commitments. And what are we really talking about here? California is one of the most prosperous states in the United States, and its economy on its own, as you've no doubt heard many times, would rank in the top 10, probably coming in around number 5 or number 6 in terms of economies in the entire world. So California has a huge economy. And many of our elected officials like to point to the fact that we can pursue progressive policies in this state on things like environmental quality and climate change and whatnot, and still have, one of the biggest economies in the world and a tremendous amount of wealth. And of course, that's all true. But the flip side to that you don't hear our elected officials talk about as much, and a lot of people don't really realize, is that California, out of all 50 states, California has the highest poverty rate of all 50 states in the United States. In fact, there's only one political jurisdiction in the U.S. that has a higher poverty rate than California, and that's the District of Columbia. So think about that for a minute. The county of Santa Clara in the Bay Area, which is probably the biggest economic powerhouse in the state of California, Santa Clara County has more millionaires per capita, than any other county in the United States of America. Its per capita personal income is higher than any other county in the country. Tremendous amount of wealth there. But if you go inland from Santa Clara into the Central Valley, there's parts of the Central Valley that still has double-digit unemployment rates, and it looks like Appalachia. So you see, there we've got two extremes here in California. We've got, on the one hand, uber wealthy people in technology and other industries that are doing extremely well, that are making vast amounts of money, but yet we have the highest poverty rate of any state in the country. So it's this gap that we have to be concerned about because, despite the fact that California has record revenues, and we should all feel good about that with respect to us being able to meet our public mandates for public safety and the different programs that we care about, that revenue is very much at risk because, if we raise rates higher, it's easier for people with a lot of money to move than it is for somebody that doesn't have any money. And, some people just don't think that the rich will ever move out of the state. Despite record revenues that we have, you see that the spending lobby in California is busy getting initiatives ready for the fall ballot to raise our taxes even higher. There's the split roll proposal that is going to propose that we tax businesses here in the state at a much higher rate with respect to their property taxes than they're required to pay currently under Prop 13. There's also proposals to add an additional 1 or 2 or even 3% to the personal income tax to tax the most wealthy of this state even more, with the idea being that the rich should pay their fair share. Well, I'm going to set aside the political question about whether the rich are paying enough. The question is will the rich put up with it? The highest tax rate right now for the wealthy in California is 13%. It used to be 10%, but it was first Proposition 25. I strike that. It was first Proposition 30 increased that from 10.3% to 13.3%, and then a few years later, Prop 55 essentially made that personal income tax increase permanent. And there's no question that the people that have $1 million disposable incomes can afford to pay higher taxes, but the question is how much more are they going to put up with? And you might say, well, what difference does it make? If they want to move out, let them move out. Well, I'm going to give you a reason to be concerned about this, and I think it'll speak for itself. Tiger Woods was born and raised in California. He'd lived in California his whole life. And the first thing that he did before he signed his first pro contract as a professional golfer is he moved out of California and he established residency in Florida. Why Florida? Florida doesn't have any personal income taxes, okay? They don't tax their residents for living there. Tiger Woods makes so much money that it begs the question, how much tax revenue did California lose? And how many middle-class jobs would California have to create in order to make up the revenue gap that happened when Tiger Woods left California? When I was a consultant in the California legislature, for those of you that don't know, I was the chief deputy director of the California Department of Finance under Schwarzenegger. And before that, though, I'd worked for 10 years in the California legislature where I was senior staff working on budget and fiscal. We did an analysis for the legislators at that time. And we determined that for every Tiger Woods that left the state of California, took that tax revenue with them, the state of California had to create 4,000, let me repeat that, had to create 4,000 middle-class jobs that paid $70,000 a year or more in order to make up for the lost tax revenue. So you can see very quickly that when the uber wealthy leave the state, it has a dramatic impact, and it takes thousands of new, good-paying middle-class jobs to make up the difference in the revenue. Okay? Those are facts. So the big picture is, and I think I'm going to go back to it, we should feel pretty good about where we are right now in terms of our fiscal situation. Of course, I wish, and I'm sure we all wish, Governor Newsom and his new administration the best as they manage the state's finances and fiscal picture. And let's hope that the recession doesn't come anytime soon. But it's also true that we need to continue building that rainy day reserve. And we need to pay close attention to what the Legislative Analyst's Office says, which is we may want to reconsider spending more on new programs such as the governor has proposed in health care and in child care and universal preschool and so on. Not that there's anything wrong with those initiatives, but we may want to think about putting even more money into that rainy day fund, because one thing we know is for sure, the recession is coming, and when it does, we're going to need every dime that we've got in order to stabilize the state's fiscal picture. So that's my snapshot of the state budget. I look forward to talking with you all again really soon. Again, this is Tom Sheehy with the Sheehy Strategy Group in Sacramento. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.